Hello and welcome to the Quilt Addicts Anonymous Beginner Quilting video tutorial series. We're going to teach you how to make a quilt from start to finish. This video tutorial series is proudly sponsored by QT Fabrics. Make sure you check out their fabrics and join in the fabric fun over at qtfabrics.com. They imagine so you can create. So we're finally going to get started sewing in this video. We're going to sew together our split 9 patch block from start to finish. If this is the first video you're seeing in this series, make sure you go check out the first few videos in this series. We go over everything you need to sew, some of the common terms and information you need when you're reading a pattern, the fabrics that you need to quilt, and then how to cut and how to sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam. All those are really important to be able to sew a block together correctly the first time, so make sure you take a minute to watch all of those. They're all free, and also make sure you download the pattern to go with this. We'll have a link to it in the video description box below, but you can also go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and do a search for the split 9 patch pattern. It's free to download, and you're going to get a special coupon code that you can use on everything you need to make your first quilt over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. All right, let's get started. So I've got my fabrics laid out, and you can see they're laid out in the exact same format that they are in the pattern. Don't worry too much about whether or not your fabrics match exactly the colors that are in the pattern. That's just kind of a guide. What you need to know is that you need your background squares to be in the middle spot in the top and the bottom row, and then in the outsides in that middle row. That's what's going to create that split 9 patch block. Now a 9 patch, for those of you who are like, what the heck is that, is basically there's 9 squares in this block here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's different types of blocks that you can do and different settings. 4 patches are really common. That's 2 rows of 2. After that, 9 patch is 3 rows of 3. You can also get a 16 patch, which is 4 rows of 4, and a 25 patch, which is 5 rows of 5. So most quilt blocks will break down into those simple construction methods. They're not always going to be straight squares. You might have some triangles or some pieced straight lines in there, but they all kind of eventually go together in this way. We're sticking with just the plain squares for this one because this is meant to be for your first quilt, so we want to keep it nice and easy. So we're going to start drawing on those skills that we learned in the previous videos to put this block together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lay these right sides together, just like this. Now once you get the hang of this and you've done it a few times, you don't necessarily need a pin at this step, but I would recommend you do it for your first couple of times as you're getting used to sewing with the fabrics together. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to sew along this side of my block. So I'm going to line up my corners, and I'm going to put a pin right in them. So this does 2 things. It tells me that this is the side that I need to sew down, and it also is going to hold them together where they need to be held together at. And the reason why I pinned really close to the corners is because you need to pin where it's going to matter, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we're joining our rows together, but it doesn't really do you any good to pin like over here because you're not sewing anywhere close to this pin. You're going to be sewing a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric. So pinning like right here isn't going to keep the fabric together where you need it to be kept together at. So make sure you're pinning where it matters. You also could put a 3rd pin if you want in the middle. But if you've cut everything correctly, then these blocks should be exactly the same size and you shouldn't have any problems with it stretching or pulling or anything, as long as you've gotten good quality fabric that's made for quilting, and then also you've cut everything correctly. So now I need to set my sewing machine up to sew that 1/4 inch stitch. On my machine, that means I'm setting it to the piecing stitch. So now I'm going to line my fabric up so that my fabric is even with the edge of that presser foot, and I'm just kind of at the edge of that fabric there. And I want to just go ahead and sew down the whole thing. And if you notice, I already pulled that pin out, and I did that because I just need it to be in place long enough to get it underneath the sewing machine. You never ever want to sew over pins. You can if your needle hits it too quickly, you can break your needle and it will fly at you. I've had that happen before and it's kind of scary. So never sew over pins, always remove them as you're coming to them. So I'm gonna go ahead and sew. And one thing to keep in mind as you're sewing is that your feed dogs are going to move the fabric through. Like if I take my hand off of this, the fabric is still moving. And so you just want to rely on your feed dogs to take that through the machine. You shouldn't be pushing or pulling or tugging or anything. You should just be guiding the fabric to make sure that it is staying even with the right edge of your presser foot. All right, so here is a great tip. So at this point, you can't really hold on anymore at the bottom because it's going to be going underneath your fabric. So what I do is I put my pointer finger next to my presser foot and I just let my finger move forward, and that will keep everything in line and keep that 1/4 inch stitch consistent all the way to the edge of your block. Here's my other great tip. When you are done sewing part of your block together, lay it back out and make sure everything is still in the same spot that it's supposed to be in, because if I don't do this, I inevitably am going to sew like this blue piece to the pink piece and I'm gonna screw it up. So I always lay it back down and I make sure everything's looking the way it should be. One other thing to pay attention to is when you're laying your fabrics out, it doesn't really matter what corners all these are in. Like I could put this butterfly down here and it wouldn't make a difference because once we get all these sewn together, we're going to cut them in half twice. But what does matter is that I use the same print in the center every single time, because that's going to become the tiny little square that's in our finished block. So you'll be able to see that when we get it all together. But for right now, it doesn't really matter what goes in your corners. It just matters that you have your centerpiece the same in every single block that you do, and that will help create a consistent look when you're done. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and sew the rest of this row together. I'm gonna go ahead and pin this for you. I'm just gonna go ahead and pin my corners on this one, but if you wanna pin your center one, you absolutely can do that. All right, so same deal. I'm just gonna sew my 1/4 inch seam all the way down. All right, so we've completed our first row. We still need to press that, but before I do it, I'm gonna go ahead and sew my other rows together as well. The process is the exact same as the others. You just wanna lay them right sides together. Get your corners lined up. Pin them. And then take it over to the sewing machine and sew your 1/4 inch seam. The next step is to press our blocks, and a lot of times the pattern instructions are going to tell you which direction to press, and I'm going to show you how to press now. But when in doubt, always press to the dark side. So that means the seam is going to go underneath whatever the darker of the fabrics are, and yes, there are lots of Star Wars jokes about that, so you can check that out. There are t-shirts. I've got a mug that says quilters always press to the dark side, and it's got Darth Vader on it. So yes, it's been said. It's a funny joke. It's cute. Okay, so here's how you press. So when you're pressing, you're going to have some instructions. They're going to tell you to press underneath a seam. So in ours, it will tell you to press underneath your center block for your top and bottom row. So this is your center block for your top row. So what you want to do first is set the seam. And to do that, all you do is you put your iron on top of it for a second. What that does is it helps the threads lay a little flatter in with your fabric, and so it just makes the seam a little bit stronger. Now, here is the number one mistake I see people make when they are starting to sew for the first time, is they just plop their iron right on top of this, and that creates pleats, and then your block doesn't end up the right size, because we want our seam allowance to be underneath this darker fabric. So what you want to do is start with your iron completely on the side that you're pressing the seam away from, so in this case that's the pink fabric, and then you're going to slowly drag your iron up onto the fabric you're working with. And then you're going to have a nice flat seam with no pleats or puckers here, and it works really fabulous. I'm going to show you how to do that again, working from the other side. So this is setting the seam, then I fold it open, and I just set my iron completely on this blue fabric. I'm going to drag it up over the side of the fabric that we are pressing the fabric underneath. So we're pressing to the dark side. So now when I flip this over, you can see that the fabrics are pressed in toward that dark black fabric with the blue and pink. So now for the next row, and that's that center row, I need to press so that the seams are underneath the outside, and that's going to do two things. One, it's going to make sure that our seams are pressed underneath the dark fabric, and it's going to make sure that our seams nest when we join our rows in just a second. I'll show you what that means next. So for this middle row, I want to press so that my seams are going underneath the dark, going out that way. So I'm going to unfold that. I'm going to set my seam. And then being careful not to set my iron over here because I don't want to press that seam yet. I'm setting it completely on my dot fabric and dragging it up just to set that. In quilting, we say pressing, not ironing, because you do not want to iron like all over like this, like you were doing a shirt or a garment. That could stretch your fabric out. You really just want to be very gentle with the fabric so that way it stays the size it's supposed to. All right, so on the last one we press so that the fabrics were going into the center, and this one we press it so the fabrics are going out to the corners. That is going to make a little bit more sense when we finish pressing them all. So I'm just going to go ahead and real quickly press this last piece. This is one of our outside rows, so it needs to be pressed to the center underneath that dark fabric. So if you haven't already, make sure you go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and download the pattern to go with this. The link is in the description for the tutorial, but you can also get it at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and just search for split 9 patch. You can download the pattern for free and follow along. So what we're going to do next, it's step 2. We've created all of our rows and we're going to join them together for step 3 to create the 9 patch before we cut it apart. So I've got my first 2 rows here. And here's where it makes a lot of sense to have pressed them underneath the dark pieces, because our top row, our seams are going in, and our bottom row, they're going out, which means when we pin them together, they're going to be going in opposite directions, which makes it a lot easier to get a really nice join where all the fabrics are coming together to make a nice like 4 corners square. I'll show you how to do that. So if I flip this over, you can see my seams are going in opposite directions. It's going to make it really great for pinning. So what you want to do is flip it over like that. And I'm going to grab my pins. And when you put these guys together, they're going to lock in place. They're not going to want to go over each other. And when you look at it from above, they should be no gap in between there or a bump. They should just meet real nicely right like that. So I'm also going to pin this in the right side of the seam allowance. This is where I talked about making sure you pin where it matters, because let's see, if I were to do this on this side and I were to pin, say like in here, when I'm sewing, I'm going to be sewing a 1/4 inch away from this. So right here I pinned really close to where that 1/4 inch is, and so I know that this is not going to shift on me when I'm sewing. Whereas here, if I'm sewing, I pinned way down here, nowhere near where I'm actually going to be sewing with the needle. So these seams could shift, and then I would end up with a seam that is off, and maybe there's a gap, or maybe it's overlapped, but it wouldn't be perfect. Whereas with this, it's going to be a whole lot better. So when you're sewing, you just want to make sure that you're pinning in the right side of the seam allowance over the 1/4 inch part, so that way it's held in place where it matters, where you're going to sew. One other thing to keep in mind, and this is very much a tactile thing, so it's hard to explain over the video because you really have to feel it. So when you put your finger over this where the seams are coming together, you shouldn't feel any gap, you shouldn't feel any bump, you should just feel a smooth transition where those seams come together. If you feel a gap or a bump, then it means that you are not going to have a perfect seam when you sew it together, because they're going to either be overlapped or they're going to be too far apart. Now, since you guys are beginners, I would also recommend pinning at the corners as well, just to help you keep everything in line as you're going. And to really be safe, you also can pin in the center of each of those blocks. And that's just to kind of keep everything in order as you're going, so you don't have to worry about things coming apart on you or you getting the fabric bunchy. All right, so I've got it underneath the sewing machine, and I've got the fabric lined up to be even with the edge of the right side of my presser foot. I'm going to remove that first pin because I just kept it in place long enough to get everything positioned underneath the presser foot. So now I can go ahead and start sewing. It's not a race, so just go as fast as you feel comfortable doing. You just want to make sure that you're keeping the fabric even at all times with the edge of your presser foot. Make sure you remove all your pins as you come to them. Now I always kind of slow down as I come to those seam joins. And if your machine has a setting where you can stop with the needle down, just turn that on because it's going to be really helpful. What I've done here is I've stopped with my needle down in the left side of that seam allowance. And what that does is it kind of acts like a pin. So it's going to make sure that that seam that we took so much time to pin in place so it would be perfect, it's going to stay that way. So now I can remove the pin on the right side of the seam allowance, and I can keep on sewing and be confident that I'm going to have a good join. I'm going to do the same thing again when I come to the other seam allowance. Just wait until I have my needle down in the left side of the seam allowance and then pull the pin from the right side. Now your pattern is usually going to tell you what direction to press. In this case, we want to press underneath the dark side, which is going to be the middle row because it has more darker squares than the outer row. So I'm going to go ahead and set that seam and press it underneath the center row. Just like before, I have my iron completely on that center row, and then I'm just slowly dragging it up. Then I'm going to lift my iron up completely and repeat for that center block and then for the outside block. Now when I'm done, I usually give it another press just to get it extra flat. You can always use spray starch if you want, or a little bit of water to help get that seam good and flat. So you can see how nice those joins are because we took the time to pin and remove our pins at specific points. They're really coming together very nicely. Now, if for some reason you were not happy with the way that these came together, you don't have to rip out the entire row. All you have to do is rip out a couple inches before and after, and then you can readjust your seam, repin it, and sew again. And that way it's much less frustrating if you just have maybe one corner that didn't turn out so perfect. You can just fix that. Now we have to repeat that process with the top one, sewing the top row to the center. So same deal, I'm going to snug those up right next to each other. They're called nesting seams. And what I do is I just kind of like start them off a little bit away from each other and bring them together until they won't go any further. And those seams really do just lock in place very nicely. Go ahead and give that a pin. I'm also going to pin my corners so that way I can make sure that those stay nice and even as I'm sewing. Once you get a little more confident in your sewing abilities, you don't have to use all these pins if you don't want to. But it's definitely a good thing to start out with it. That way things don't shift on you too much as you're sewing and everything turns out about the size it should be. Now I'm going to sew down the other side as well. And do not feel like you need to go as fast as I am. Stopping with my needle down and that seam allowance, then pulling the pin. For this one, we also want to press the seam underneath the center seam because we still have those darker fabrics there. So I'm going to have my iron completely on the outside row and drag it up to the center. And then completely lift up in between and repeat on the other ones. I'm going to go ahead and hit those seams a little bit more. And we've got some really great joints here because we took the time to pin. So this is called the 9 patch because we have 3 rows of 3 and 9 squares in it. And this is pretty as it is, but it's a little boring. So I'm going to show you how to really easily turn this into a split 9 patch so that way we can have some fun and do something really fun and creative with this block. Now, if you've done everything correctly, it should measure 5.5 inches from your center seams in your block. So from the seam on the right to the seam on the left should be 5.5 inches. If it's not, figure out what the average is for all of your blocks. Like say if they're all a little bit smaller and they're more at 5.25, then just divide that in half and that's the measurement you're going to use to cut these in half twice because we want them all to be the same size when we trim them down. So my blocks do measure 5.5. So I'm going to line it up so that the 2 3/4 inch mark is even with the left side of my seam allowance here. So I've got that 2 3/4 inch right even with this, and then I have an inch line even with the top of my seam here. That's going to make sure that everything is nice and square when I cut it apart. So now with my pinky on the side and my hand right smack dab in the middle, I'm going to go ahead and trim right down the center of this block, and without moving anything, I'm going to flip my ruler. Of course, then I just moved it while I was doing it. I'm going to flip my ruler here, and I'm going to move this down so that 2 3/4 is now even with this bottom seam allowance. And I've got an inch line still even here. So I know that I'm going to have nice square blocks. So I'm putting my hand here. Make sure to keep your fingers out of the way of the rotary cutter. And I'm going to go ahead and cut across the top. Now when I move the ruler, I have my split 9 patch blocks. Pretty cool, right? So if you have trouble cutting across the top like that, just rotate your entire mat and cut so that it's going up and down like you're used to. So now we have something really fun to do. We get to turn these around a little bit. So I want to make sure that my butterflies are diagonal from each other. And my flowers are as well. So if you're following along with your pattern, this is step 5. So what I've done here is I've rearranged my blocks so that I have my butterflies in my top left and bottom right corner, and my polka dot is facing each other at the center here. Now in the bottom left and top right, I have my 2 flowers, and in these, the polka dots are pointing out. And If you're at this step and you're not using the same fabric I am, or even if you are, you probably want to take a picture because you want to have all your other blocks go together like this. So that way you have nice flow of fabric and your eye isn't drawn to any one spot when you put it together. So what we have to do now is we're going to sew this back together and create our official split 9 patch block. So one of the fun things about this pattern is we don't actually have any seams to match at this point, because this seam comes where it's nice full length piece of fabric. Same deal with this one. We have a nice full piece of fabric where that seam is. So we don't have to worry about joining any seams like we did when we put the 9 patch rows together. So what I can do is I can just flip those right sides together. And I can pin my corners, get those nice and lined up. And I'm going to go ahead and pin my center too here. So now I can go ahead and start sewing. Remove that first pin. You just need it to keep your corners together as you go. Now if you find that things are not totally the same size, all you need to do is kind of give it a little bit of a pull. You don't want to stretch it out of place, but just a little bit of tension will help make those fabrics end up being the same size when they're sewn together, and there won't be enough of a pucker to really worry about it. So for here, I'm just kind of giving it a little bit of a tug here at the bottom, not much. And then I'm just going to put my second finger here to kind of help guide that fabric and keep my edges nice and even as I'm sewing it together. So we've got our first row sewn together. Now we need to get our second row sewn together. So we've got our 2 rows sewn. We need to press these and then we can sew them back together. Just like before, we're going to press under the dark side. So in this case, this has more dark on it in here than this block does. So I'm going to press underneath the left side for the top row and underneath the right side for the bottom row. Just like before, you want to go ahead and set your seam, unfold it, and starting with your iron on the side you're pressing the seam away from, just slowly drag it up. And then maybe hit that seam a couple more times with that iron. One thing to note about pressing, I've chosen really dark fabrics for my background squares. That is kind of opposite of what most people do. So if you chose dark fabric for your focus squares and a light fabric for your background squares, then you would want to reverse all of these pressing instructions so that you're always pressing to whatever the darkest fabric is. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so now we've got to press these together, and again we've got seams going to the right on the bottom and to the left on top, so we're going to be able to nest those seams. And still here we don't have seams to match because they're not coming together at the same point, so I can just go ahead and pin in the centers there to kind of keep everything in line as I'm sewing down. So when I flip these right sides together, I can just go ahead and bring those together until the seams lock in place. Pin in the right side. Then I can pin my corners together. Throw in pins over here. And then I want to pin in the center too. And it doesn't have to be exactly in the center, just close enough. So that way you have a nice sort of stopping point to sort of keep everything in line as you go. All right, so I've got that presser foot down and the fabric even with the right edge of my presser foot. And I pulled my pin out because we just needed it to keep it in place until we got this far. I'm gonna go ahead and sew until I hit that needle, the pin that's in the center. Go ahead and remove that before I sew over it. And the next time I stop is going to be when I hit that center seam allowance. So when that needle is down in the left side of the seam allowance, then I'm going to go ahead and pull the pin for the others. Now, one thing to note, sometimes when you're sewing along, this seam that is supposed to be going this way, sometimes it can get going the other way when it hits the features on your throat plate of your machine. So just kind of keep an eye on that and make sure it's still going the way it should be, so you don't get seams slipping the wrong way. That'll help your finished quilt lay a lot flatter. Now we need to press this one last time to get the block open. What I would do is I would press, and this is what I'm going to do, half of the blocks so that the seam is going under the top row and half so that the seam is going under the bottom row. What that will do is it will allow you to nest your seams as you sew your rows together too. Well, this is it. We've made our split 9 patch block. You need to make 15 more of these in order to get enough for the quilt top. We're making a lap quilt for this one, as we're going to be quilting it on our home sewing machine too, so you don't want something too large and unwieldy for your first time sewing on your home sewing machine for quilting. So in our next video, I'm going to show you how to chain piece, so that way you can sew lots of these all at once and have a lot of efficiency. And we're also going to, in our future videos, talk about how to sew your entire quilt top together, how to layer and baste, how to quilt it, and eventually bind and take care of it. So don't go anywhere. Make sure you watch the rest of the videos, because we're going to take you all the way through to the end of completing your first quilt. But in the meantime, make sure you go download the pattern for the split 9 patch block over at shop.quiltaddicts.com. You can we have a link to it in the video below, or you can go there and just search for split 9 patch. You can download the pattern for free, and we're giving you a special coupon code that you can use to get everything you need to make your very first quilt. A big thanks to QT Fabrics for sponsoring this video tutorial series. We're able to bring it to you for free because of them. So make sure you go check them out at qtfabrics.com. Thanks so much, and make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can see all of our quilting tips and tricks. And until next time, happy quilting.